Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners. Tonight, I invite you into a place where the wind does not howl, it whispers, where the trees stand so close together that sunlight forgets how to reach the ground, and silence settles over everything like a shroud that has never quite lifted. They call it Hollow Pines. The locals speak of it only when they must, and even then, in lowered voices, of a sound that drifts through the woods at dusk, soft as breath against the ear, luring the curious and the unwary deeper into the trees. Some who heard it were never seen again. Now, one man has come to Hollow Pines, not to listen to legends, but to silence them. A man of precise habit, waxed moustache, and a mind that misses nothing, or very nearly nothing. His name is Hercule Poirot, and what he uncovers beneath those ancient pines will prove, once again, that the quietest places often hold the deadliest secrets. So settle in, dim the lights if you dare, and let us step quietly into the woods together. Arrival at Hollow Pines. The train had left Hercule Poirot at a station so small it scarcely deserved the name. A single wooden platform, a rusted sign swinging on one hinge, and a station master who looked as though he had not smiled since the coronation of George V. Beyond the station, the road narrowed quickly into a track of packed earth, and beyond that track, the pines began. Poirot did not care for forests. He had said as much, quite firmly, to his old friend Chief Inspector Japp, who had written to him, in that abrupt manner of his, a queer business at a place called Hollow Pines. 3 deaths in 18 months, all called accidents, all in the same stretch of wood. Local police are out of their depth. Thought of you. Poirot had sniffed at the letter when it arrived, folded it twice, and told his manservant George that he had no intention whatsoever of leaving the comforts of London for the damp and the mud of some forgotten English village. And yet here he was, 3 days later, standing at the edge of a wood, so dense and so still that even the birds seemed to have abandoned it, his patent leather shoes already regretting the decision on his behalf. "Monsieur Poirot?" The voice belonged to a broad-shouldered young constable, cap in hand, who had been waiting beside a small motor car the colour of old rust. "Constable Whitlock, sir. Inspector Hale sent me to fetch you." "Ah, you are most kind." Poirot inclined his head with the particular grace of a man who considered courtesy to be one of the last true civilities left in a fraying world. "Tell me, Constable, how far is it to the village?" "'Bout 2 miles, sir, but the wood sits between us and it. Quickest way straight through." Poirot regarded the trees with the faint distaste of a man observing something he suspected of harbouring bad intentions. "Straight through," he repeated. "Eh bien, let us go straight through then, and I shall keep my umbrella close at hand, for I am quite certain the sky here has not yet decided what sort of day it wishes to be." The drive was slower than Poirot expected, for the track was rutted, and the constable drove with the caution of a man who did not entirely trust the road beneath him. On either side, the pines rose thick and close, their upper branches knitting together so tightly overhead that the afternoon light came through only in thin, broken threads. There was, Poirot noted, an unusual quality to the quiet. Not the ordinary hush of woodland, but something more deliberate, as though the forest were listening, rather than merely being still. "You have lived near this wood long, Constable." "All my life, sir. Grew up in the village. And you have heard, I think, the stories." Whitlock's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. "Everyone's heard the stories, sir. Don't mean everyone believes them. But you do not go into the wood after dark." It was not a question, and Whitlock did not answer it as one. He said nothing at all, and Poirot, watching him from the corner of his eye, found this silence a good deal more informative than any words could have been. They came out of the trees at last, into a modest village of grey stone cottages, a squat church with a crooked steeple, and a public house called the Whispering Bough, whose painted sign, a pale, indistinct shape drifting between dark trunks, struck Poirot as being in rather poor taste for an establishment that presumably wished to attract custom. Inspector Hale was waiting for them outside the police house. a heavy-set man with tired eyes, and the look of someone who had not slept properly in some weeks. He shook Poirot's hand with the relief of a drowning man taking hold of a rope. "Monsieur Poirot, I'll admit, I didn't think Jap would manage to talk you into coming all this way." "He did not talk me into anything, Inspector. I came because a case of 3 deaths, each dismissed as accident, each occurring in the same small wood, is not a case that a man of my particular disposition can simply ignore." "It offends," Poirot said, tapping 2 fingers against his breast. "Something in here." Hale gave a short, humorless laugh. "Well, I hope your disposition's got room for one more then, because we've had a 4th. Poirot went very still. "When?" "4 days ago. Young fellow named Timothy Reed, local schoolteacher, well liked. Not a drop of trouble in him his whole life. Found at the bottom of Miller's Gorge, other side of the wood, neck broken. Coroners calling it a fall." "And you do not believe it was a fall?" "I don't know what I believe anymore, Monsieur Poirot, and that's the God's honest truth." Hale rubbed a hand over his face. "All 4 of them, Reed and the 3 before him, they were found within a few hundred yards of each other, near a stretch of the wood the locals won't go near, even in daylight. And every single one of them, before they died, told somebody they'd heard something." "Heard something," Poirot repeated softly. The whisper. Hale looked at him sharply. "You've heard about that already?" "I have heard a great deal, in a very short time, Inspector, though I have, as yet, understood very little of it. This is often the way with these affairs. One arrives with a satchel full of rumor and must sort it, piece by piece, until something resembling the truth emerges." Poirot glanced back toward the dark line of trees behind them, and for a moment his expression lost its customary composure, replaced by something more thoughtful, almost wary. "Tell me, Inspector," this whisper, "have you yourself ever heard it?" There was a pause, longer than Poirot expected. "Once," Hale said finally. "Just the once. And I'll tell you now, Monsieur Poirot, whatever it was, whined through the branches, some trick of the ground, I don't know. I've no wish to hear it again." Poirot said nothing for a moment, merely stood watching the wood as the last grey light of afternoon began to fail behind it, and thought, not for the first time in his long career, that some silences were a great deal louder than any sound. "Eh bien," he said at last, turning back toward the village. "Then let us begin, Inspector, with the poor Monsieur Reed. The dead, after all, cannot lie to us, though I have found on occasion that they can still surprise us. The first body. The village mortuary was, in truth, little more than a back room behind the doctor's surgery, cold and smelling faintly of carbolic soap. Dr. Alfred Pruitt, a thin man with spectacles that seemed perpetually on the verge of sliding from his nose, drew back the sheet with the brisk efficiency of a man who had done this rather more often in recent months than he cared for. Timothy Reed had been, in life, by all accounts a pleasant young man of perhaps 28. In death, he was pale as the sheet that had covered him, his neck bent at an angle that even to Poirot's untrained eye seemed unnatural. "Broken neck," Pruitt said, "consistent with a fall of some 20 feet or more. Miller's Gorge runs about that deep in the spot where he was found." "Consistent with," Poirot repeated. "That is a most careful choice of words, Docteur. You do not say it is a fall, you say it is consistent with one." Pruitt hesitated, adjusting his spectacles. "I've examined 3 bodies from that wood in 18 months, Monsieur Poirot, and each time I've written accidental death on the certificate because I had no evidence to write otherwise. But there's a thing that's bothered me every time, and I'll admit it to you now, because Inspector Hale tells me you're a man worth being honest with." He drew back the sheet a little further, indicating the dead man's hands. "Look here." Poirot bent close, his sharp eyes narrowing. The fingernails on both hands were broken, several torn down to the quick, and beneath them, dark with dried blood, were small fragments of what appeared to be bark and soil. "He was clawing at something," Poirot murmured. "That's my thought too. A man falling into a gorge doesn't have time to claw at anything, Monsieur Poirot. It's over too quick. But these nails look as though he were fighting to hold on to something, or fighting to get away from something, for some little while before he went over. And the other three? They had the same? The first two, yes, though I confess I did not think much of it at the time. Old Silas Bennet I put down to nerves. The man was known to walk in his sleep. The second, a young woman named Clara Voss. I noted it, but the coroner was in a hurry, and I did not press the matter. The third, Pruitt paused. The third was different. Found with no such marks at all. Face quite peaceful. That one troubled me more than the others, if I am honest. Though I could not have told you why. Poirot straightened, drawing his own small notebook from his coat, and making a brief, neat entry. 4 deaths, Doctor, and no two of them entirely alike. That is either a very careless killer or a very clever one who wishes us to believe the two things are the same when they are not. You think it's murder, then? All of them? I think, at this moment, very little at all, and I would ask you not to repeat that admission to Inspector Hale, who I suspect already believes me more capable than I have yet proven myself to be in this matter. Poirot allowed himself a small, dry smile. But I think a man does not claw at bark and soil while falling to his death by simple accident, Dr. Pruitt, and I think 4 deaths in one small stretch of wood is a coincidence only a fool, or a very frightened village, would accept without question. It was Constable Whitlock who led Poirot, an hour later, along the very path Timothy Reed had walked on, the last evening of his life. The schoolteacher had left the village public house a little after 9, according to 3 witnesses who had shared his table, in perfectly good spirits, having declined an offer to be walked home by his fellow teacher, Miss Eleanor Finch. Said he fancied the night air, Whitlock explained, picking his way over a root that had buckled the path. Weren't nothing odd in that? He often walked home alone, and his path took him near the gorge? Not directly, sir. That's the strange part. His cottage is this way. Whitlock gestured to the left, where the trees thinned somewhat. Gorge is off to the right, near on half a mile out of his road home. No reason for him to have gone that way at all, far as anyone can tell. Poirot stopped walking. The wood here was very quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears, rather than simply existing alongside them. Somewhere above, a branch creaked, though there was no wind that Poirot could feel against his face. "Half a mile out of his way," Poirot said slowly, "in the dark. Into a wood. The village will not enter after nightfall. Something drew him there, Constable. A man does not wander half a mile from his own front door for no reason at all. Not unless something has called to him more loudly than his own good sense." "The whisper," Whitlock said, very quietly, and did not seem pleased to have said it. "Perhaps." Poirot resumed walking, though more slowly now, his small eyes moving carefully over the ground, the trunks, the low-hanging branches. "Or perhaps something a great deal more ordinary, dressed up in the clothing of a ghost story, so that no one thinks to look for it properly. I have found, in my long experience, Constable, that villages which believe wholeheartedly in curses make excellent hiding places for men who do not believe in them at all." They walked on in silence until the trees fell away abruptly, and the ground dropped into the wide, rocky scar of Miller's Gorge, its bottom already deep in shadow, though the sky above was still touched with the last grey light of afternoon. Poirot stood at the edge for a long moment, looking down, and then, to Whitlock's evident surprise, he lowered himself carefully onto his hands and knees at the very lip of the drop, and began to examine the earth with the close, patient attention of a man reading a difficult letter. "Constable," he said after a moment, "come and tell me what you make of this." Whitlock knelt beside him, in the soft earth at the gorge's edge, half hidden beneath a fold of dead leaves, were 2 parallel gouges some 4 inches apart, as though something had been dragged, or had dragged itself, toward the drop. "Could be an animal, sir. Deer, maybe." "It could be," Poirot agreed, though his tone suggested he did not think so at all. He reached out and brushed the leaves back further, and beneath them found a third mark, smaller, half obscured. the unmistakable heel print of a man's boot, pointed toward the gorge, its impression far deeper than a simple walking stride would account for. "Someone was standing here," Poirot said softly. "Standing very firmly, Constable, as a man stands when he is either pushing something or being pushed himself." He rose, brushing the soil from his knees with a fastidiousness that seemed almost comic, set against the grim little scene at his feet, and looked out over the darkening gorge with an expression Whitlock would later describe to Inspector Hale as being the first time he had seen the famous detective look, if only for a moment, genuinely unsettled. "Eh bien," Poirot murmured, half to himself. "It seems, Constable, that our whisper in the woods has left behind rather more than a ghost story. It has left behind a footprint, and a footprint, unlike a legend, can be made to answer questions." Whispers among the trees. The whispering bough was near empty when Poirot and Inspector Hale settled themselves at a corner table that evening, save for an old man nursing a pint by the fire, and the landlord, a stout, red-faced fellow named Alderton, who polished the same glass for a full 5 minutes before he could bring himself to approach their table. "You'll be wanting to know about the wood," Alderton said, without preamble, setting down 2 glasses of ale neither man had ordered yet. "Everyone who comes through that door with a policeman wants to know about the wood." "Then perhaps, Monsieur Alderton, you would do me the kindness of telling me what you would tell everyone else," Poirot said pleasantly. "And then, if you are willing, what you have not told anyone at all." Alderton's eyes flickered, just briefly, toward Hale, then back to Poirot. He pulled out a chair without being asked, and sat. "It goes back further than anyone living properly remembers," he began. "My grandmother used to say there was a woman, long ago, who lived out past the gorge, a widow, kept to herself, and folk said unkind things about her, the way folk do. Said she cursed the wood before she died, so that anyone who came looking to disturb her rest would hear her calling to them, soft as anything, right up until she called them close enough to fall." "A charming tale," Poirot said, "though I confess I have heard a dozen very like it in a dozen villages, and none of them, as yet, have involved 4 actual bodies." "That's because none of the others had hollow pines," Alderton said, and there was no humor at all in his voice now. "I don't know what it is, Monsieur Poirot. I'm not a fanciful man, but I've walked that wood in daylight my whole life and never heard a thing. And I've known 3 men in my time who swore on their mothers' graves they heard a voice calling their own name from among the trees, soft as a woman's whisper. And every one of those 3 men is dead now." "Their own name," Poirot repeated slowly. "Not merely a whisper, but a whisper that knew them. That's what they said." Hale shifted in his chair. "Alderton, you never told me that part. You never asked me the right question, Inspector. Begging your pardon." Alderton's mouth twisted into something that was not quite a smile. "Folk round here don't like to say more than they must about the wood, say too much, and next thing you know, you're the one who starts hearing it." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And you, Monsieur Alderton, have you ever heard it call your name?" There was a long pause. The fire cracked and settled. "No," Alderton said finally, too quickly. "No, never." Poirot said nothing, merely regarded the landlord over the rim of his untouched glass, with the patient, faintly amused expression of a man who has just watched someone tell a lie and has decided, for the moment, to let it pass unchallenged. It was Miss Eleanor Finch, the schoolteacher, who received them the following morning in the small stone cottage she had shared, until 4 days prior, with Timothy Reed's friendship, and, Poirot suspected within moments of meeting her, a good deal more than friendship besides. She was a composed young woman, with red-rimmed eyes, and the careful stillness of someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. "He wasn't a fool, Monsieur Poirot," she said, before he had even properly seated himself. "Whatever they're saying in the village, whatever nonsense about curses and whispers, Timothy did not go wandering into that gorge because some ghost called his name. He wasn't the sort. And yet, mademoiselle, he did go, half a mile from his own road home, into a wood the village fears to enter after dark. Something took him there. Miss Finch was quiet for a moment, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. He said something to me, the week before. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Tell me. He said he'd been hearing things near the old Bennet cottage. That's the widow's place, the one from the story, though it's long since fallen to ruin. Said it sounded like someone crying for help, he thought. She stopped, swallowed. He thought it might be a child, lost in the wood. He said he meant to go and look properly, in daylight, when he had the chance. He didn't want to frighten anyone by mentioning it before he was sure. Poirot's expression sharpened. A child crying for help? Not a whisper calling his name. That's what he told me, Monsieur Poirot. I don't know why everyone keeps saying whisper. Timothy never once used that word to me. Poirot sat back slowly, and for a moment said nothing at all, turning this new piece over in his mind, with the care of a man examining a coin he suspects may be counterfeit. A whisper that called men by name, and yet a young woman crying for help, in the same wood, heard by the very man who later died there. Two stories, perhaps, wearing the same coat, or one story that had simply been told and retold until it no longer resembled the truth it had started from. Mademoiselle Finch, he said finally, I think you have given me something rather more valuable than you realize. Tell me, in your time in this village, have you heard, yourself, of anyone else who claimed to hear a child, rather than a whisper calling a name? She frowned, thinking, now that you mention it, yes. Old Mrs. Bennet, no relation to the widow, a different family entirely. They only share the name by coincidence, I believe. She mentioned something similar to me once, at church. I'd quite forgotten until now. Then I think, mademoiselle, that our whisper beneath hollow pines may have more than one voice, Poirot said quietly, rising to take his leave, and I begin to suspect that at least one of them belongs to someone very much alive. Questioning the suspects. Inspector Hale had, by the time Poirot returned to the police house, assembled a list of names. Those who had known the four victims, those who lived nearest the wood, and those who, for one reason or another, the village regarded with the particular suspicion reserved for anyone slightly out of step with its rhythms. There's not many of them, Monsieur Poirot, Hale said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the table, dotted with small crosses, marking where each body had been found. It's a small place. Everyone knows everyone. Which is rather the trouble. Half of them have alibis given by the other half, and I can't say I trust any of it further than I could throw it. Then let us begin, Poirot said, with the man who owns the wood itself. That man was Edmund Thorne, a landowner of perhaps 60 years, whose family had held the deed to Hollow Pines and the surrounding acreage for 4 generations. He received Poirot in a study cluttered with old ledgers and hunting trophies, a tall, spare man, with the guarded manner of someone long accustomed to being asked questions he did not care to answer. I've told the inspector everything I know, Monsieur Poirot, which is precisely nothing. I don't go into that wood if I can help it. Never have. And yet, it belongs to you. It belongs to my family on paper. In practice, Monsieur Poirot, that wood has belonged to itself since long before I was born, and I've had the good sense not to argue the point. Thorne's fingers drummed once against his desk. My father lost 2 dogs in there. Never found so much as a collar. If you're looking for a murderer, I'd suggest you look among the living, not among old stories. But I'll tell you plainly, there are men in this village who'd have reason enough to want Timothy Reed out of the way, whatever your ghost stories might suggest. Poirot's brows lifted with interest. Indeed? And which men, Monsieur Thorne, would those be? Reed had been courting Miss Finch, as I understand it, quite seriously. There's a fellow, Robert Carew, works my land as gamekeeper, who'd had his eye on her a good deal longer, and didn't take kindly to being passed over. I don't say it's proof of anything. I say only that a jealous man makes a wood full of ghost stories a very convenient place to arrange an accident, should he be so inclined. It was, Poirot reflected as he left Thorne's study. Precisely the sort of information a man offers a little too readily when he wishes to point suspicion firmly away from his own front door. Though this did not make it untrue, only worth examining with rather more care than Thorne himself had offered it. Robert Carew proved to be a broad, weathered man of few words, found mending a fence at the edge of Thorne's land, who answered Poirot's questions with the flat, unhurried patience of a man who had clearly been asked them before and expected to be asked them again. I fancied Miss Finch once," he admitted, without particular shame. "Long before Reed came to teach at the school. That's old business, Monsieur Poirot, and it doesn't make me a murderer. Where were you, Monsieur Carew, on the night Timothy Reed died?" "Here, my own cottage, 1/2 mile from the wood, asleep by 10. "My sister can tell you the same. She was stopping with me that week." Poirot made a note, though something in the easy, well-rehearsed quality of the answer caught his attention, the way a slightly crooked picture frame catches the eye in an otherwise orderly room. "And the sister, she is certain of the hour?" "Certain as anyone can be who was asleep herself, I'd imagine," Carew said, with the ghost of dry humor, and Poirot, despite himself, found he rather liked the man, which he noted was no reason at all to trust him. It was in questioning the third name on Hale's list, a quiet, nervous young woman named Sarah Voss, sister to the second victim Clara, that Poirot made the misstep he would later privately admit to Inspector Hale, though never, if he could help it, to anyone else. Sarah Voss lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of the village, and she answered his questions in a low, halting voice, her eyes rarely lifting from her hands. "My sister went into that wood at dusk, near on every evening for a month before she died," she said. "I begged her not to. She said she couldn't help it, said something called to her that she couldn't ignore, even though she was afraid of it." Poirot, listening to this, and noting the woman's evident distress, her reluctance to meet his eye, the slight tremor in her hands, allowed himself to form an impression rather too quickly, that here was a woman who knew more than she was saying, who was perhaps concealing some guilty involvement in her own sister's death. He pressed her rather harder than the moment strictly warranted, suggesting, with more bluntness than tact, that grief alone did not account for such visible unease, and that he would advise her most strongly to be entirely honest with him. Sarah Voss burst into tears, and it was several minutes, and considerable awkwardness, before Poirot understood, through her broken, furious explanation, that her unease sprang not from guilt, but from a private shame she had told no one in the village, that she herself had heard the whisper, twice, in the weeks since her sister's death, and had been too frightened and too ashamed to admit it to anyone, for fear of being thought mad, or worse, of being told she would be the next to die. "I am so very sorry, mademoiselle," Poirot said, and meant it entirely, setting aside his notebook. "I allowed my eagerness for an answer to outrun my good sense, and I have caused you pain that was neither necessary nor deserved. This was a poor use of my time, and a poorer use of yours." He paused, then added, more gently, "But you have, in your distress, told me something of real value. Tell me now, if you are able, what did the whisper say to you when it came?" Sarah Voss wiped her eyes with the back of one trembling hand. "It said my name, Monsieur Poirot. Just my name, over and over. So soft, I could hardly be sure I heard it at all. But the second time," she hesitated, "the second time, it seemed to come from a different direction than the first. Closer to the old cottage. Closer to the ground, almost, as though whoever spoke it was crouched low among the roots." Poirot went very still. "Closer to the ground," he repeated softly. "Mademoiselle Voss, I think you have just told me something that the wood itself has been trying, for 4 deaths, to keep hidden. A second death." Poirot did not sleep well that night. He lay in the narrow bed of the village's one small inn, listening to the wind move through branches he could not see, turning over in his mind the fragments he had gathered. A whisper that called men by name, a child crying that was, perhaps, no child at all, a voice that came from close to the ground, as though its speaker crouched among roots, rather than stood among branches. "Pieces! All of them! But not yet a shape." He was roused before dawn by an urgent knocking at his door. Constable Whitlock stood in the corridor, cap askew, his face pale in the lamplight. "Monsieur Poirot, Inspector Hale sent me straight away. There's been another." Poirot was dressed and in the motorcar within minutes, his moustache, for once, not entirely attended to, a fact which he would later note with some private embarrassment. The body had been found at first light by a farmer driving his cattle along the eastern edge of the wood. Old Mrs. Bennet, the church-going woman Miss Finch had mentioned, the one who shared a name with the widow of legend, but no blood relation. She lay at the foot of a steep bank not far from the ruined cottage that gave the old story its setting, her walking stick some feet away, one shoe missing entirely. Dr. Pruitt knelt over her with the tired, methodical air of a man performing a task he had hoped never to repeat. Broken hip, and a blow to the head that I'd wager did the real damage. "She was 71 years old, Monsieur Poirot. A fall like this could kill a woman half her age." "And yet," Poirot said quietly, crouching beside the body, with the same careful attention he had given the gorge 4 days before, "you do not think it was merely a fall, doctor, or you would not have summoned me before you had even finished your examination." Pruitt hesitated, then turned the old woman's hand gently, palm upward. Beneath the nails, as with Timothy Reed, were small dark fragments of soil and bark. "The same," Poirot murmured. She was clawing, as he clawed. "There's more." Pruitt reached into his bag and withdrew a small scrap of paper, damp and creased, that had been found tucked into the woman's coat pocket. "Whitlock found this when we moved her. I don't know what to make of it, but I thought you'd want to see it before anyone else got their hands on it." Poirot took the paper carefully. The ink had run in places, but the handwriting, small and cramped, was still legible enough. "I have heard it 3 nights now. It knows my name, and it knows what I did. If anything happens to me, tell them to look at the old well behind the cottage. I should have said something years ago." "God forgive me." Poirot read it twice, then a third time, his expression growing very still and very grave. "It knows what I did," he repeated softly. "Not a curse from beyond the grave, Dr. Pruitt, but a woman confessing to something she believed a voice in the wood already knew. This is no longer merely a matter of ghost stories and frightened villagers." He rose, folding the paper with great care into his own notebook. "This is a woman who believed, in her final days, that someone, or something, was punishing her for a sin she had carried a very long time." "The old well," Whitlock said slowly, "behind the Bennet cottage. I know the spot, sir. It's been dry and covered over since before I was born." "Then, Constable," Poirot said, straightening his coat with sudden decision, "I think it is high time we uncovered it again." The ruined cottage stood in a small clearing some quarter-mile further into the wood, its roof long since collapsed, its stone walls swallowed by ivy and moss, until it seemed less a building than an outcrop of the forest itself. Behind it, half hidden beneath a tangle of bramble, was the well, capped with a heavy wooden lid gone soft with rot, weighted down with a single flat stone. It took Whitlock and 2 other constables the better part of an hour, with ropes and considerable effort, to lift the lid and lower a lantern into the depths. Poirot stood at the edge, peering down into the dark, his expression unreadable in the grey morning light. "Anything?" Hale asked, arriving somewhat out of breath, having been summoned from the village. "Bones!" Whitlock called up, his voice echoing strangely from below. "Small ones. Look to be a child, sir." A silence fell over the little clearing, broken only by the creak of rope and the distant call of some unseen bird. "A child," Hale said quietly, removing his hat, as though in the presence of something that demanded it. "Good God! How long do you suppose?" "That, Inspector, Dr. Pruitt will be better able to tell us than I," Poirot said, though his voice had lost some of its usual brisk composure. He looked out toward the ruined cottage, toward the dark line of trees beyond it, and for a long moment said nothing at all. "But I think now that our whisper beneath hollow pines is not the voice of some long-dead widow calling the curious to their deaths at all. I think it is the voice of someone very much alive, who has known for years exactly what lies at the bottom of that well, and who has been waiting, with considerable patience, for the right moment to make certain no one else ever learns of it." "You think someone's been killing to keep this quiet? For years. I think, Inspector, that 4 deaths and a confession left in a dead woman's pocket suggest exactly that." Poirot's eyes moved once more to the well, then to the woods surrounding them, dense and watchful. "And I think, moreover, that whoever has done this has made one very serious error in judgment." "What's that?" "They have made me curious, Inspector Hale," Poirot said grimly. "And I have found, in a long career, that very little in this world survives that particular condition for very long." The grey cells at work. Poirot spent the remainder of that day not among the trees, but alone in the small room the inn had given him, seated at a narrow writing desk, with his notebook open before him and a pot of tisane growing cold at his elbow. It was here, he had always maintained, that the true work of detection was done. Not in the chasing of footprints through mud, useful as that could be, but in the quiet, patient ordering of the little grey cells. He began, as he always began, by writing down what he knew and separating it, with great care, from what he merely believed. Fact: 4 deaths in 18 months, all within a small area of hollow pines. 3 showed marks of clawing beneath the nails, a struggle, not a simple fall. The 4th, the first victim, Silas Bennet, showed no such marks and was found peaceful, unlike the others. Fact: a child's bones found in a well behind the ruined Bennet cottage, a well known to the recently deceased Mrs. Bennet, whose confession suggests guilty knowledge of that child's fate. Fact: the whisper, as described by witnesses, calls the victim's own name, save in the case of Timothy Reed, who told Miss Finch he heard a child crying, not a whisper calling his name. Fact: Sarah Voss described the whisper's second appearance as coming from close to the ground, as though its source crouched among the roots, rather than stood among the branches. Poirot set down his pen and considered this last point for a long while. A whisper that came from the ground. Not, perhaps, a ghost drifting between the trunks at all, but a person, quite deliberately positioned low, perhaps concealed within some hollow or hidden vantage, imitating a sound calculated to draw the listener toward a particular spot. He thought of the gorge, and the boot print he had found at its very edge pointed toward the drop. He thought of Timothy Reed's torn fingernails and the gouges in the soil that suggested a struggle very near where that print had been left, and he thought, with a small private frown, of his own error with Sarah Voss, how readily he had leapt toward suspicion of the wrong person entirely, mistaking grief and shame for guilt. It was, he told himself firmly, a lesson worth remembering, that a frightened witness and a guilty one may wear, for a moment, the very same face, and only patience, not eagerness, could tell the two apart. There came a knock at the door. It was Inspector Hale, looking rather more animated than Poirot had yet seen him. "Dr. Pruitt's had a first look at those bones," Hale said, settling into the room's single armchair without invitation. "Child, as Whitlock thought. A boy, he reckons, no more than 7 or 8 years old when he died. And here's the thing, Monsieur Poirot. He's cross-checked against the parish records. There's no record of any local child gone missing in the last 30 years. Not one." Poirot's brows drew together. None at all. None. Which means either the boy wasn't from this village, or the record of his disappearance was never made at all, Poirot finished slowly, because whoever was responsible for his death took considerable care that no one should ever come looking for him. He rose from the desk and moved to the small window, looking out over the darkening rooftops, toward the black shape of the wood beyond. "Inspector, I think we must return to Mrs. Bennet's confession. She wrote that the whisper knew what she had done, not merely that she feared discovery, that she believed the voice in the wood possessed direct knowledge of her guilt. That is not the language of superstition, Inspector. That is the language of blackmail. Hale sat forward. You think someone's been using this whisper business to frighten people into silence. Not ghosts at all, but a person, playing on the old story to keep people afraid and quiet. I think it very possible that someone in this village has known for many years about the child in the well, and has used that knowledge, dressed in the clothing of a local legend, to control those who shared in that guilt, or who threatened, however unwittingly, to expose it. Poirot turned from the window. Consider, Inspector. Silas Bennet, the first victim, died peacefully, without struggle. Perhaps he was already old, already frightened, already compliant. Perhaps his death required no violence at all, only a final push at the right moment. But Clara Voss and Timothy Reed, and now Mrs. Bennet, each showed signs of struggle. Each, perhaps, resisted in some way. Perhaps each of them, in their own manner, threatened to speak the truth aloud. But who, Monsieur Poirot? Who in this village would have reason to hide a child's death for 30 years? Poirot was quiet for a long moment, his sharp eyes distant, turning the question over as a jeweler turns a stone to catch the light. That, Inspector, he said finally, is precisely the question I intend to put to Monsieur Edmund Thorne tomorrow morning. For I have just recalled something he said to me, quite in passing, on the day we first met, which I confess, I did not, at the time, give the weight it deserved. He told me his father lost 2 dogs in that wood, many years ago, and never found so much as a collar. Poirot's expression darkened. I begin to wonder, Inspector Hale, whether it was truly dogs that Edmund Thorne's father lost in Hollow Pines all those years ago, or whether that particular story, like so many others in this village, has simply been dressed up to hide a far less comfortable truth. The trap. Edmund Thorne received Poirot the following morning with rather less patience than on their first meeting, pacing before the cold hearth of his study, while Poirot seated himself, unhurried, in the chair opposite. I've already told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot. I don't see what further purpose is served by. You told me, Monsieur Thorne, that your father lost 2 dogs in Hollow Pines many years ago and never found so much as a collar. Poirot's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, but his eyes did not leave the older man's face. I wonder now whether you would care to tell me the truth of that story, rather than the version you have, I think, told yourself for so long that you have nearly come to believe it. Thorne's pacing stopped. I don't know what you mean. I think you do, monsieur. A child's bones have been found in the old well behind the Bennet cottage. A boy, no more than 7 or 8 years old, dead some 30 years, and no record anywhere in the parish of any child gone missing in that time. That is not the sort of thing, Monsieur Thorne, that happens in a small village without someone knowing of it. Without someone, perhaps, having caused it. The colour had drained from Thorne's face. He sat down heavily behind his desk, all the earlier bluster gone out of him at once. It was an accident, he said, very quietly. God help me. It was 31 years ago, and it was an accident. Tell me. My younger brother, Michael. He wasn't right, Monsieur Poirot. Not in the head. Given to fits of temper, fits of fear, things the doctors of that time had no good name for. My father was ashamed of him, kept him away from the village mostly, out here on the estate, out of sight. The day it happened, Michael had wandered off into the wood, as he sometimes did, and Thorne's voice caught. I was 16. I was meant to be watching him. We quarrelled, near the old cottage, and I pushed him, only to make him stop shouting, only to— He pressed a hand over his eyes. He fell against the well cover, which was rotten even then, and it gave way beneath him. By the time I looked down, he was already— And your father? My father decided, that same night, that no one would ever know. He said it would ruin the family name, ruin everything he had built. He capped the well properly himself, told the village Michael had been sent away to a hospital in the north, and made me swear, on my mother's grave, that I would never speak a word of it as long as I lived. Thorn's hands were shaking now. I have kept that oath for 31 years, Monsieur Poirot. I did not kill Silas Bennet, or Clara Voss, or Timothy Reed, or poor old Mrs. Bennet. I swear it before God. I have done nothing these 30 years but keep silent, exactly as my father made me swear to do. Poirot studied him for a long moment, and found, to his own quiet satisfaction, that he believed him entirely. Then who, Monsieur Thorn, besides yourself and your late father, knew what truly happened to your brother? Thorn was silent for a long moment. Only one other person, he said finally. The Bennets' housekeeper, at the time. A young woman my father paid very well, and very quietly, to keep her silence. She's an old woman now, Monsieur Poirot, but she still lives in this village. Her name? Agnes Carew, Thorn said. Robert Carew's mother. Poirot sat with Inspector Hale that evening in the small back room of the police house. The map of the wood spread once more between them. 4 small crosses, and now a 5th, marking Mrs. Bennet's body, dotted across its surface like a constellation Poirot had not yet learned to read. Robert Carew, Hale said slowly, gamekeeper on Thorn's land. Jealous of Timothy Reed over Miss Finch, by Thorn's own account, and his mother the one person besides the Thorns who knew what really happened to that boy. It fits together with a neatness I find almost too convenient, Inspector, and I have learned to be suspicious of neatness in matters such as this. Poirot tapped the map thoughtfully. But consider, if Agnes Carew knew the truth, and if her son learned it from her, perhaps only recently, perhaps upon her deathbed or in some unguarded moment, then Robert Carew would have inherited not merely a secret, but the means by which to frighten an entire village into silence, using nothing more than an old legend, already half believed by everyone who lived here. You think he's been playing the whisper himself? Hiding in the wood? Calling out names? I think it is time, Inspector, that we found out for certain, and I think the surest way to do so is not to ask Monsieur Carew politely whether he has been murdering his neighbors, for I do not imagine he would tell us the truth, even if we asked very nicely indeed. Poirot's eyes glinted with something sharper than his usual composure. I think, instead, we must give the whisper beneath hollow pines a very particular reason to call out one more name before this affair is finished, and I think, Inspector, that name should be mine. Hale stared at him. You want to walk into that wood after dark and wait to be attacked? I want to walk into that wood after dark, Poirot corrected, with the faint, precise dignity of a man determined not to be misunderstood, with Constable Whitlock and 2 of your best men positioned at a discreet distance, and I want it known, quite deliberately, around the village beforehand, that Hercule Poirot has uncovered the truth of the child in the well, and intends to announce the name of the guilty party come morning. A secret kept for 30 years does not survive gracefully, Inspector, when it believes itself only hours from being spoken aloud. I think our whisper will not be able to resist one final attempt to silence it. And if you're wrong? If whoever's behind this decides not to come at all, or decides a knife in the dark is quicker than any whisper? Poirot allowed himself a small, tight smile, though there was little humor in it. Then I shall be very glad indeed, Inspector Hale, of your 2 best men and their discreet distance. But I do not think I am wrong. A person who has killed 4 times to protect a secret does not stop simply because the detective investigating them has grown cautious. They stop, Inspector, only when the secret is spoken, or when they themselves are. The truth beneath the pines. Night fell over hollow pines with a stillness that seemed, to Poirot, almost deliberate, as though the wood itself were holding its breath in anticipation of what the darkness might bring. He walked the path toward the old Bennet cottage alone, his cane tapping softly against the packed earth, a lantern swinging gently from his hand, its light throwing long, uncertain shadows among the trunks on either side. Behind him, At careful distance, Constable Whitlock and two other men moved through the trees with the practiced quiet of those who had been given very firm instructions not to be seen. Inspector Hale himself waited nearer the village, ready should word need to reach him quickly. Poirot had let it be known, quite openly, over supper at the Whispering Bough, that he intended to walk to the old cottage that night to confirm one final detail before announcing his conclusions in the morning. He had said it loudly enough for Alderton to hear, and trusted, correctly as it turned out, that a piece of news so significant would travel through the village faster than any telegram. The ruined cottage came into view at last, pale and broken in the moonlight, the well behind it, now capped once more, with fresh boards at Hale's instruction. Poirot set down his lantern upon the old garden wall and stood, apparently at his ease, though every sense he possessed was drawn tight as a wire. "A fine night," he said, to the empty clearing, in the pleasant conversational tone of a man greeting an old acquaintance. "Though I confess, Monsieur Carew, I had rather expected you would come to meet me before now." For a long moment, nothing stirred. Then, from the deep shadow beneath a fallen trunk some yards distant, a low voice answered him, not a whisper now, but a man's voice, flat and weary. "You knew then." Before I even said a word, Robert Carew stepped into the moonlight, and Poirot saw that he held, loosely at his side, a heavy wooden cudgel of the sort a gamekeeper might carry for entirely ordinary purposes. "I suspected," Poirot said. "I did not know, not entirely, until this moment." "Your mother told you the truth of what happened to young Michael Thorne, did she not? Perhaps only recently. Perhaps she believed, near the end of her life, that the secret had grown too heavy to carry any further." "She told me a year ago, near the end," Carew said. "She'd carried it since she was a girl, and it had eaten at her something terrible. I don't think she meant for me to do anything with it, Monsieur Poirot. I think she only wanted, before she died, to have said it aloud to someone, just once." His voice hardened. "But once I knew it, I saw what it could do for me. Old Silas Bennet had been the one who found the boy's body, all those years back, helped my mother and the Thornes cover it up, when he was just a young man himself, terrified of losing his position. He'd lived with the guilt of it, every day since. It wasn't hard to frighten him, an old man already half convinced the wood was haunted by what he'd helped bury. A whisper in the dark, calling his own name, was all it took to send him walking toward the gorge, in a state fit to lose his footing entirely, on his own account. And Clara Voss. She'd found an old letter of my mother's, years back, that hinted at something buried near the cottage. She went looking, out of nothing more than idle curiosity, and I couldn't risk what she might find." Carew's jaw tightened. "Timothy Reed heard her, that last week, heard me, rather, practicing the sound near the old cottage, and mistook it for a child crying. Come looking in daylight, like the fool school-teacher he was, and found rather more than he bargained for when I caught him at the gorge's edge that night, asking questions he'd no business asking. And Mrs. Bennet, Silas's widow, she'd begun to suspect the truth herself. After Silas died, started writing things down, asking questions in the village. I couldn't have that. For the first time, something like genuine regret crossed Carew's weathered face. I never meant for it to become what it became, Monsieur Poirot. I told myself each time it was the last. But a secret this size doesn't let a man stop once he's started protecting it. And Timothy Reed's courtship of Miss Finch, Poirot said quietly. That was never truly your motive at all, was it? Only a convenience, a reason for the village to look elsewhere, should suspicion ever fall in your direction. Carew said nothing, which was, Poirot reflected, answer enough. You have told me a great deal, Monsieur Carew, Poirot said, and I think you have told it to me because some part of you, like your mother before you, has grown very tired indeed of carrying it alone. Perhaps I have. Carew's grip tightened on the cudgel. But I'll not hang for it, Monsieur Poirot. Not for a secret that was never truly mine to keep in the first place. He moved then, quick for a man of his size, closing the distance between them. But Poirot, who had positioned himself, with characteristic care, rather nearer to the old garden wall than idle chance would suggest, stepped swiftly aside as Whitlock and the two constables broke from the trees at a run, exactly as instructed, and had Robert Carew borne to the ground before the cudgel ever found its mark. "Eh bien," Poirot said, straightening his coat and retrieving his slightly overturned lantern with the fussy dignity of a man restoring order to a moment that had briefly threatened to become undignified. "I confess, Monsieur Carew, I had rather hoped you would simply talk. Violence is so very untidy, and I had only just had this coat properly pressed." Later, much later, with Carew safely delivered into Inspector Hale's custody and the wood beginning to grey with the first suggestion of dawn, Poirot sat once more at the little writing desk in his room at the inn, his notebook open before him, though for once he found he had little appetite for making further entries. There came a soft knock, and Inspector Hale let himself in, looking older than he had 4 days before, but easier in his shoulders than Poirot had yet seen him. "He's confessed to all four," Hale said, settling into the armchair. "Every detail, same as he told you in the wood. I don't think he'll fight it in court, from the look of him. I think, in a strange way, he's relieved it's finally over. That does not surprise me, Inspector. A secret carried too long ceases, after a time, to feel like protection at all. It becomes, instead, a kind of prison, and I think Monsieur Carew had grown very weary indeed of his own particular cell." Poirot closed his notebook gently. "It is a curious thing, is it not, that this whole affair began with a widow's curse, 3 generations old, and ended with nothing more supernatural than a frightened boy's death, a father's shame, and a housekeeper's silence passed down like some poisoned inheritance, from mother to son. You don't seem surprised there was no ghost in it at all. I am never surprised, Inspector, when a legend proves to be nothing more than the truth, wearing a disguise. Villages love their ghost stories, I think, precisely because a ghost asks for nothing beyond a shiver and a locked door after dark. A living guilt, carried by living people, asks for something rather more uncomfortable. It asks to be looked at honestly, and very few of us, in the end, are entirely brave enough for that." Poirot rose and moved to the window, looking out at Hollow Pines one final time as the first grey light crept between its branches. "The quietest places, Inspector Hale, often hold the deadliest secrets, not because the woods themselves are unquiet, but because we are so very good, all of us, at burying what we cannot bear to hear." He turned back from the window with something of his old brisk composure restored. "Now, Inspector, if you will forgive me, I think I have had quite enough of English forests to last a great many years, and I find myself in considerable need of a proper cup of coffee, a warm fire, and a return, as soon as may reasonably be arranged, to the civilized comforts of London." Hale laughed, the first true laugh Poirot had heard from him since his arrival, and rose to shake his hand. "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. Truly, do not thank me, Inspector. Thank instead your own good instinct in writing to Chief Inspector Japp in the first place. And thank, if you are able, poor Mrs. Bennet, whose final act on this earth was to leave behind a scrap of paper that spoke, at last, a small piece of the truth aloud." Poirot collected his hat and cane from beside the door. "It is, I think, the very least any of us can do for those who come after, to speak, when we are able, rather than to let the silence do our lying for us." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the pale morning light, leaving Hollow Pines behind him at last. Quieter now, though whether it would ever again be truly silent, only time, and perhaps the trees themselves would say.